Hello and good evening to all. On behalf of NCAER National Data Innovation Center, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. It's almost 2 years since the pandemic started in India and still continuing, but with much less severity now, thankfully. Last couple of years were very difficult for many of us, and particularly so for the vulnerable population of our country. So the objective of today's webinar is to look back, reflect, and discuss how the last 2 years have been. We have a very exciting panel today involving researchers, policymakers, and bureaucrats with extensive on-ground experience as well as an overall understanding of the impact of the pandemic and social protection programs that could help mitigate this impact. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for agreeing to be part of today's discussion and giving your valuable time. So we have received regrets from one of the panelists, Sri Rajendra Bhatt, who have to attend the Rajasthan Assembly session. I mean, he's actually currently attending the Assembly session where a bill regarding tribal development is being discussed. And Sri Bhatt is the Commissioner of the Tribal Area Development Department at Udaipur. So there is no way he could have escaped it, although it was scheduled at a very last minute by the Chief Minister of Rajasthan. So even if he wanted to attend it very much, he won't be able to make it today. So the remaining panelists will have more time. A couple of days back, I attended an event celebrating India's success story of COVID-19 vaccination. I mean, it is true that we have done a wonderful job in vaccinating majority of our population. But nonetheless, the consequences of the pandemic on people's lives are devastating on multiple fronts. So before I hand it over to Sonal, Professor Sonal D. Desai, who kindly agreed to moderate today's discussion, I'd like to give a little bit background of the work we have been doing in assessing the consequences of the pandemic for the vulnerable populations and the risks of impoverishment faced by them. So our work is in collaboration with the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, CPAN, which has been monitoring poverty in the context of COVID-19 in many low and middle income countries around the world, and India is one of the countries. We recently published a bulletin together, the India COVID-19 Poverty Monitor Bulletin, and the link of the bulletin was given in the webinar announcement, and some of you may have gone through it. So CPAN's COVID-19 Poverty Monitoring Country Bulletin are compiled using a combination of original qualitative data collected from a small number of affected people from each country, interviews with local leaders and community development actors, as well as secondary data from a range of available published sources. So some of the CPAN colleagues are present today in the panel. I can see Vidya in the panel. So for the India Bulletin, we have conducted multiple rounds of in-depth household interviews, focus group discussions, and key informant interviews in the Delhi NCAER region, as well as some parts of Rajasthan. So we first started with telephone mode of data collection for in-depth household interviews, and then eventually switched to face-to-face method when the severity of pandemic has lessened. So this qualitative data has given us very useful insights as it captured the lived experiences of people quite accurately, which the quantitative data often fails to do. So I'd like to thank my team members, Dinesh, Manjista, who is one of the panelists today, Avinav, Pallavi, Sumiran, and Vijay for their dedicated effort in getting this work done. CPAN's Poverty Monitoring Initiative is supported by the COVID Collective, which is essentially a platform based at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS UK, to provide rapid social science research response to inform decision making on COVID-19 related development challenges. The project is funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCTO. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Sonal to continue with the proceedings of today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have a really distinguished group of panelists here. And the goal of today's discussion is really to reflect on where we have been, but more importantly, where we need to be next. Thinking about, how do we sort of recover from the scarring that has been left behind as a part of this 2-year-long pandemic? And even more importantly, how do we prepare for future based on the lessons that we have learned today, rethink issues around a social protection network and poverty related support systems and so on. Just reconceptualize, what has the pandemic taught us and where do we go from it and emerge stronger than before, given what we have learned. So without further ado, let me just introduce our today's panelists and invite them to provide their opening remarks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each of our panelists one by one, provide a short introduction to them, let them ask them to invite their opening remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes, and after that open it up for discussion between panelists, with the audience, and with I hope that we will have a very exciting discussion as we move forward through this hour. Our first panelist today is Professor Tanika Endo. Professor Endo is a professor at the Institute for Human Development and the coordinator for the Center for Gender Studies at IHD. Her work is mainly in the area of education, including on the issues of out-of-school children and low-cost private schools. She has worked on human development reports and vision documents for various states, including Delhi and Uttarakhand. She has recently contributed to a human development report for the scheduled tribes. Dr. Endo has also engaged in collaborative study with UNICEF on the post-COVID situation for vulnerable populations in India. Professor Endo, please start.
Thank you so much, Sonal, for calling me, inviting me here. And it's a great opportunity for me to share the findings from the study which you mentioned, which was the last thing you mentioned in the introduction. So this was a study. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
It's okay, right? Okay, thanks. So this was a study which was jointly done by UNICEF and IHD. And a lot of people have contributed, although I'm just presenting some of the headline findings here relating to joblessness and so on. I will just at the outset give a little bit of details about the study. I think you just mentioned the rapid response initiative, when something happens, some crisis takes place. So that was the idea behind starting, which is how UNICEF started it. And we came along for analysis. And they did a community-based monitoring mechanism. And I have to say at the outset that this relates to the first wave of COVID. So there were 4 rounds of survey, starting from June, July 2020 till December 2020. In between, these were done in August and October, November, and then December. And in each round, like first one, 5,000 households around were covered, and in the next 3, around 6,000. But the mechanism was, let me also tell you the geographical distribution. It was 6 rural and 6 urban districts across 7 states. And of course, not really representative as far as state goes, just a small sample that way. But overall, across India, quite similar questions were canvassed. And the mechanism was community-based monitoring because initially there were these social protocols, you can't have face-to-face interviews and so on. So what had been done was the CSOs who are active in certain habitations, they were contacted, and the entire community monitoring kind of thing had been set up, and there were community volunteers who had done some of the household surveys, and there were also the volunteers' perception on the ground about various things, various variables. And the overall, as I said, it was June, July 2020 till December 2020. And during June, July, there were questions also asked about the pre-lockdown period, to the respondents. And how do you feel? What is your income like compared to the pre-lockdown period, and so on. Some of the perception questions were also there. Now, I'll just, first of all, of course, flag the joblessness. And again, another thing, because it's such a large study, I'm sorry, I'm kind of just chipping in at bits and pieces. It had urban and rural households, as I said, and there were mostly villages in the rural and the slum areas in the urban habitations. And the main activities were that of casual workers they comprised the bulk of the respondents. And next came the regular workers, which were smaller, much smaller in share. And of course, there were the people who did not have jobs or unemployed. And the activities were agricultural work and construction work in the rural areas, and in the urban areas, factory work, construction work, some service work, etc. Now, of course, the joblessness increased tremendously after the pandemic, as we all know. And it touched about 26% in the urban areas in June, July. And in rural areas, it was lower at 20% or so. After that, however, as there was gradual unlocking, there was a recovery. Over the next few successive rounds of survey till December, there was a recovery. And the joblessness actually fell down to, by December, it came to around 8 to 9% of the total respondents. Respondents were the main earners of the family. Now, however, the quality of the employment was not the same that they had started out with, because there were more casualization. There were much higher share of casual workers. Regular work, which is supposed to be of better quality, that had gone down. And what is even more interesting is when the respondents were asked in December, what is your wage like compared to the pre-lockdown period? Now, nearly 3/4 of the urban respondents said that it was lower, and in the rural areas, 60% said it was lower. So clearly, although the employment situation picked up and the joblessness share went down, the quality was not the same. Another very interesting question was asked during this community-based monitoring exercise. The main earning member was asked that, do you have enough of rice, pulses, oil, all these, grains and wheat to meet your family's food requirement for the entire family for the coming week, just for 1 week. You'll be surprised to know, even in December, not all said they had it. It was about 64% of the urban respondents, they said they had enough food. And for the rural, it was better. It was 78%, but even there, not all the respondents said they had enough availability of food. And another question was also asked about the expenditure. These are, of course, all perception based, because, what do you think? How has the expenditure on, protein-rich food items, how they have gone? Have they increased, decreased, remained the same, and so on? So for the urban respondents, we found that about nearly 40%, like 37%, they said it had gone down. And it was a little less, like 33% or so. But obviously, the children, they really need this milk, eggs, and fruit, and so on. They need those food, and it is expected that their development and growth and nutrition would definitely have been impacted by such a large share saying that their expenditure on such protein-rich food items have gone down. I would like to just highlight, if I have a little bit of time, for among these marginalized groups of people, segments who were even more vulnerable. And these two segments were identified as the home returnees and the female-headed families. Now, home returnees are, as we all know, these are the migrant workers who used to work in the urban areas, but we are all familiar with the hardships they faced as they made their way back to their homes in the villages. So this was in the rural sample, they comprised about 26 to 28%. So there was a very distinct difference between them and the resident people who were staying there all along. These people had gone back to their home. So we found that in terms of joblessness, they had higher shares compared to the resident households. And also they had lower access to food. You remember the question that we said for the next week for the entire family, if you have enough food grains and oil and pulses and so on. And there too, their vulnerability was higher. The home returnees' vulnerability was higher. Now, even this joblessness, as I said, that was also higher. And very similarly, the female-headed families, the female-headed meaning again, the main earner is a female in the family. That percentage was quite high in urban areas. It was taken like 20 to 25%, and in rural areas, it was 11 to 13%. But I can't show you the graph here, but it is so interesting. Throughout the survey periods, their joblessness was higher than the male-headed families. Throughout. I mean, they were definitely far more vulnerable, and even food availability-wise, they did not fare well. They fared worse than the male-headed families. Now, if I have 1 or 2 more minutes, I don't know, I'll just go into the PDS and Manrega and those findings. Now, that is one very encouraging thing, that yes, PDS did function well. It was giving out, a lot of people have said that they got what their entitlement was, but the access was not universal. Because in the urban areas, I think 82% urban respondents said that they had ration cards. And in the rural areas, it was higher, 93%, but even then not universal. And among those who had ration cards, could they draw their ration, or did they draw the ration? Yes, we asked in December, in previous month, did you draw it? And we find that quite high shares. The access to ration card was 76% urban households. That was actually lower. So 82% was of those ration card holders who drew the ration the previous month. And in 88% of the rural households had the ration card, and out of them, 93% had taken the benefit of the ration. But overall, not very discouraging. And one thing we found a gap area was that PDS shops were not always, close to the habitation or within the habitation rather. I mean, quite I think nearly half of the urban respondents said that the ration shops were outside their habitation. And that differed quite a lot across the different states, in certain cities also. Now, Manrega again, of course, provided a lifeline, for the rural population. But there again, the demand was, not everybody who sought it got it. Like some 70%, this was for the, I think the December survey, some 70% got it. Those who had job card, they were seeking work and they got work. Not everybody got the work, but not even, only 60% in October, November, and around half in December were seeking work also. So not everybody did. And we all know that wage payment, timely wage payment is a very, very important issue in terms of Manrega. So that again, we found that about in December, 62% said that they received timely wage payment. So these were the things. I don't know whether I should talk about the awareness of social protection, other social protection schemes now, or should I talk later? It all depends on the time.
We can bring it up later, because I have a feeling social protection is going to be featuring large in our discussion as we sort of move forward. Thank you very much. I want to flag a couple of things that you said, which might be worthy of discussion as we sort of go along. First things you mentioned was that a lot of migrant workers had returned back and who were in a pretty vulnerable position. Now, if we think back on part of the poverty decline that we had seen pre-pandemic period, a substantial amount of it was associated with remittances received from the migrants. Okay, and those remittances stopped, and in some cases, my understanding is there were reverse remittances. Okay, and so it's probably going to affect going along the poverty decline that we might see. Second part of the poverty decline that we had seen had to do with a movement towards non-agricultural labor among the rural workers. And while agriculture emerged as sort of this major support system and lifeline during the COVID pandemic, that particular source of poverty reduction also kind of declined. So I think these are the two things that we have to think about what's going to be the shape of poverty as we go along. Okay. Our next panelist is Dr. Paramita Sen, and it gives me a great pleasure to invite Paramita Sen, who has set up and now runs the research and data vertical at Seva Bharat, where she and her team conduct research on entrepreneurship, empowerment, labor, disaster resilience, and leadership. Okay? Everything through gender and informal economy lens. Okay? Under the aegis of Seva, she has represented Seva and been involved in work with Niti Aayog, Delhi government, National Rural Livelihood Mission, ILO, and Lok Sabha. It is a great pleasure to invite you to speak, Paramita. I have been so impressed by the interesting work that Seva has done through the pandemic that we'd love to hear more about the work and your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonal. It is an honor to be here and to be participating in these conversations that NCAER is running. And thank you so much for that. I'm speaking here on behalf of the work that Seva Bharat has been doing for the last 2.5 years and the data that has been collected. Just to give everyone a little bit of context of where my data comes from, there is a certain sample selection here. We primarily draw on data from the Seva membership, so women who are involved in the Seva movement, as well as the communities that these women live in. So not all the data is of a Seva member, but it is of the community in which Seva has a presence. This does lead to, given the fact that Seva isn't a research organization, is primarily, it's a movement and focuses on struggle and development, there is a little bit of bias here that we're going to see in the results. It might not be truly reflective of the informal economy in some ways, because anytime we see a problem, I have to inform the Seva implementation people and they will go and try and fix it. So keeping that in mind, especially when we look at the impact and how it changes over the first and second wave, right? However, based on this, one thing I do want to point out is that there is scope for a lot of when we're talking about the kind of solutions that we can look forward to. So I'll also draw a little bit on what is it that we did with this data and how we saw some changes come about and trying to find some scope for the path to recovery out of this pandemic. So that being said, I am drawing data from Seva communities, and most of this is done by our grassroots researchers and by our data collectors, who are all women from the community. We use this pandemic as an opportunity to, they all, due to a variety of reasons, had to become digitally literate. And we use this as an opportunity to have them start switching to trying to use data collection and interviewing and research skills as an alternate livelihood, and just expanding the scope of what research could mean. That allowed us to work within communities and do tracing and following up over expansive periods of time. And most of it is actually in-person interviews because it's being done by community members. And part of the data is also what they deemed appropriate. Okay, so that's the context within which I'm talking. So I was really excited to read this the Poverty Monitoring Index report, because I think it's a concise document that really captures some of the biggest trends that we've seen over the last few years. I think it captures the entire holistic picture of what's happening. We're building on what Tanuka Ben has already done, right? And taking a sort of intersectional lens to this data. I'll talk about how, given what we find in this report, what an intersection professional lens allows us to see and where the nuances are that we can trace out. So for instance, that, I mean, the basic conclusion I drew was that this is, I mean, it's a dire situation that we're seeing, but women informal workers face significantly more adverse effects than the average population. And this isn't taking into account the vulnerabilities that you might face beyond just being a woman employed in the informal sector, or a widow, a female-headed household, someone with a disability, and all of those. So just taking it at a very, in a sense, large level of what women informal workers face. I use the example of agriculture workers because I thought, I mean, that idea of like agriculture becoming something that saved a lot of communities and that was some form of stability in the middle of a really severe pandemic, was the impact of women agricultural laborers, right, and the women that we work with. Some of the things that we saw was so women agriculturalists who continue to be agriculturalists and continue to remain employed in this agriculture sector through the pandemic, was they face this double challenge. So PMI, for instance, discusses the impact of mobility, right, and what lockdowns do to raising grain rice, to raising the prices in the market of vegetables, and how it's very hard for farmers to make it someplace. However, in our experience, we saw that women faced a double challenge, right? So it's not just a question of the fact that there was a lockdown. Even when we managed to get a permit to get women access to the market, right, and to be able to travel. So this is something that we did with a farmer producer company out of Bihar. We got them a permit to travel to the market and sell like collected goods from sell the collected harvest from across women farmers. However, these women weren't able to do that, right? So we did this, we tapped into government schemes and all, but they don't have a mobility asset themselves. Women just generally aren't really allowed to tap into like driving. They don't own vehicles themselves to do it. So even when we're talking about mobility and the access to the market, right, you were talking about the gender impacts of the pandemic, coupled with the double impact of what it means to be a woman in a state like Bihar, right? So we're talking about like a double impact of what happens to her. Many women who are agricultural laborers have access to small land holdings, which means it became much harder for them, given this access to market as being a challenge, to then aggregate up and sell in the market. So they just switched out of this, and it helped them survive, right? But they switched out of selling as a trade and agriculture as a trade, and ended up pivoting to subsistence farming. And it kept them going, and it kept them going through the pandemic. But these are impacts that are going to have, these are things, the trends that we saw, that we are concerned about the slightly longer term impacts. Livestock, which often is an asset for women in a rural economy, for women in the rural economy, it turned out to be a challenge for them because livestock proves to be an additional burden when you're trying to provide fodder and agricultural supplies for these women. So around all of this, however, this is not to say that it was completely dire, right? So first wave resulted in a rapid erosion of savings. And the subsequent lockdown, and over here we're talking about close to 80% of the women ran out of their savings during the first lockdown. This was a study that we did back in May of 2020. Significantly, what we found in a qualitative wise, that it was women who were running through the savings at a higher rate than men, again, because of the gendered nature of how women save money. Women were saving it in cash, so it was easily available at home, and women were running households while men had migrated out in many cases. So the impact on savings, women and households were facing it slightly more, like they were facing the adverse effects slightly more than men were facing it. However, by the time the second wave came around, and I think this is something that's being reflected in Tanukava and the study that Tanukava is talking about, is that we, like as a society, we started figuring out how to enroll women into PDS and other schemes and try and make sure that the second wave was a little easier for them financially. Food security, we don't know what the long-term consequences of this are, right? Because through this pandemic, because of either a lack of access to the market to buy food or lack of money, people were relying entirely on ration kits. And that's great, including what the PDS does or what comes through aid. But if you're talking about just rice, wheat, and pulses, vegetables and dairy consumption are what have taken a massive hit for families during this time. And we don't know what the longer-term consequences of this are. We're talking about an entire range of children, for instance, who've gone 2 years without regular consumption of dairy products, right? And this, we don't know what the longer term things are. We don't know what the longer term impacts of COVID are without taking into consideration further vulnerabilities of poverty, class, gender, physical ability. And we're already seeing the shorter term impacts of those who survived the Delta wave and the second lockdown, but survived COVID through that, right? And combined with access to inadequate nutrition, we're seeing stamina, immune systems taking a hit, and not much we can do about it because flexibility in work options doesn't exist for a domestic worker or a construction worker. And then finally, the one thing I want to point out, which is something that we've just noticed and we're a little concerned about and we don't know, is the experience of the past 2 years has led to a weird industry of exploiting vulnerable workers just men and women, with regards to enrollment into multiple schemes. And I'm saying this just because we've come back from the field, and this was something that really stressed us out. So we've been trying to enroll people in eShram, in the eShram portal. It's insurance, and we want women to do that. However, women BD rollers out of Bengal are paying agents a much larger sum of money to get enrolled, and women are just being in many ways exploited to sign up for multiple schemes at much higher exploitative rates because they're so worried about what will happen when the next lockdown comes and will need access to a scheme to keep themselves afloat. So they're ending up going through these much faster, quicker solutions, which aren't proving results, instead of going through the longer bureaucratic way. So that's a conversation we need to be having. Sorry, just to like move on from a slightly depressing thing to what does a path to recovery look like? I don't want to make this seem entirely negative. There are ways out of this. We've seen, so where are we seeing success? So one of them is in skills and digitization, right? As I already mentioned earlier, to ensure that everyone got rationed in the first wave and medical support and advice in the second, we had to pivot to a digital model. And what we found was that it works, right? And this data has all been collected by women on their phones, right? Women who have at most a 5th grade education. And because of this, they're now picking up alternate trades. We're talking about data collectors, product photography, marketing agents, experience hosts, and all of these, right? And again, these are not going to be full-time employment opportunities, maybe, but women are diversifying the trades and going in, like trying to explore into alternate livelihoods in a way that shows that you can have the scope beyond some of the traditional ways of working, which might not sustain this. The other things that we've seen work is cash transfers. So right now we're doing this in partnership with UN Women, Seva Bharat. We've done this for 100 women micro entrepreneurs, just a small thing that we've been trying. And we've seen that it's resulted in a success rate of over 80% of women who got this cash transfer restarting or pivoting their business, right? So this is something that we've all known for a very long time, and giving money directly to people works. And now there's decades of evidence to continue supporting this, including through this. And finally, and this is what the pictures above my head are supposed to support, is the impact of collectivization. Given that I'm talking about joblessness, I'll talk about collective entrepreneurship very briefly here. But essentially, across the informal economy, we saw women lose access to income, markets, no social security net. However, what we did see was those that were affiliated with a collective enterprise, so when an enterprise is co-owned by a group of women micro-entrepreneurs, there was a retention of livelihoods, and the enterprise is the one that took on the burden to make sure that there was access to the market for their shareholders. So this is something we see in the Seva experience, but we're also seeing this globally, right? We're seeing this out of Sabah in Nepal, we're seeing this out of Mondragon in Spain, and these are just some of the examples, right? So there's this sense of like collectivization, right? Like pooling the resources together that really does help, right? And this isn't the case of entrepreneurship, but we can see this happening in like different communities and how people have protected this. And essentially this idea of like, how do we support this collectivization? How do we continue promoting this and ensuring that societies and communities support each other? Because you can't always rely on this external system. And of course, that external system needs to exist, but how do we balance that? And those are some of the questions that I look forward to exploring with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paramita. It was a fascinating discussion, and I actually want to highlight something that I have heard you, Renana Jabwala, and others talk about in the past. You know, for those of us who are sort of somewhat farther away from people whose lives we are trying to understand, data collection during the pandemic was a very difficult task. Okay, Seva had this phenomenal ability to tap into its network and connections to provide very quick feedback. And something at one conference, it was mentioned as the hyper-local solution of how to collect data. And it was just a fascinating exercise in what you were able to do. This has also been sort of an interesting opportunity for those of us who work on issues related to large data, qualitative data, and sort of coming from more of an activist and civil society background, that we are beginning to realize that each set has something to contribute, and perhaps we need to work together more frequently than what we have been doing. The other thing that I actually want to highlight that you mentioned was the advantage that was being taken of the vulnerability of individuals during that particular segment. Because we also found that a lot of people did not receive their salary, which they were supposed to have received. Okay. And so in some sense, employers also took an advantage of individuals. And this is something we kind of need to think about as we see in future around protection of workers and so on. Our third panelist is my dear colleague, Dr. Manjistha Banerjee. Manjistha is a fellow at National Council of Applied Economic Research. Her primary areas of research are education, family demography, social change and gender, migration and survey methods. At National Data Innovation Center at NCER, she's involved with experimentation on different types of data collection techniques, telephonic surveys to assess the impact of COVID pandemic in Delhi NCR, qualitative data collection to understand the risk of impoverishment in the context of COVID-19, and questionnaire design for the upcoming round of India Human Development Survey. Manjistha, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sonal, for this opportunity. Now, at the start of this discussion, Shantanu mentioned that we have, as a country, we have had much success with the vaccination program. Now, if we contrast this with the education. I would like to highlight that it seems that the government has completely neglected this aspect of people's life. And somehow in the qualitative interviews that I was doing, I found that this was also true in the households, particularly because their livelihoods were so much affected that education, the impact that the pandemic had on the lives of education did not organically emerge in the discussion. It emerged only when you probed further. So now in highlighting the impact that COVID has had on education, I would draw on two sets of data. The first set of data is the Delhi Metropolitan Area Survey. Now this was a survey that we started in 2019, but it had to be halted when the COVID hit the country. And the other data that I would like to draw on are the qualitative interviews that we did as part of the COVID Poverty Monitoring Initiative. So what has been the impact of the pandemic on education? The first and foremost is that on the dropout rate. Now, if we compare the rate of dropout, the percentage of dropout between 2019 and 2021, it is, as one would expect, much higher for 2021, and is particularly striking for the age group of 6 to 10 years and 11 to 14 years. The Endline survey of DMAS that we did in October, roughly around October 2021, revealed that 12% of children in the age group of 6 to 10 years had dropped out, and the comparative percentage for children in the age group of 11 to 14 years is 9%. This is slightly unusual because dropout rate increases as one moves up the age ladder. So one conclusion is that because of schools that were closed during the pandemic, many young children could not enroll themselves into school. Indeed, about 3% of children in Endline reported not being able to take admission in school as one of the learning disruptions that they faced. And to let me draw on an interview that we had with a key informant in rural Uttar Pradesh to highlight the impact the pandemic has had on young children. So she said that the biggest impact of COVID has been on education. Those who are older are smart and can study online, can study on their own, but young children cannot study on their own. Because of school, they would study something, even attend private tuition. When schools were closed, why would they attend private tuition? They, as in the young children. Now, we did not find the gender differences in Delhi NCR to be significant, but this is likely to be an artifact of this region alone. Another study which has been done in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar did find a gendered effect of a school closure, and therefore the conclusion from Delhi obviously cannot be extended to rest of the country. What were the reasons that children dropped out from school? The first and foremost is, of course, the financial stress, which meant that if children were enrolled, particularly in private schools, they withdrew them from school. In fact, often the fact that the children that the education was being carried out online, and parents were not able to afford that mobile phones, became a reason for children dropping out from school. The other aspect of education during pandemic is online education or e-learning. Here again, we find that for all the children in the age group, of 6 to 18 years, only 50% had access to any form of remote learning, but which includes live in-person online classes, share of educational materials through WhatsApp and other digital modes, but primarily through WhatsApp. And if they received educational materials from teachers who would drop them in person in their homes. So if we take into account all these three types, in the Delhi NCR region, only 50% had access to this type of education. And of course, there is children from marginalized communities have poorer access. So in rural areas, remote access drops down to 35%, and among the poorest quintile, it is only 31%. And in most instances, this took the form of sharing of educational materials via WhatsApp rather than live online classes, which would be the closest substitute for in-person classes. Poor quality of education, poor quality of online education is what was told to us by parents during the interviews that we did. So let me just read out a conversation that I had with the father in rural Haryana. So I asked if the school has organized online classes to cope with the learning disruptions, to which he replied, yes. But he added, online classes naam ho raha hai. In other words, online teaching was nominal. They sent pictures via WhatsApp and asked students to complete tasks and ask for fees. He further added, what is the school doing? They are merely sending copies of textbooks, pictures of the textbooks. Children have to complete the task and send it back. It was implied and not stated. Where is the teaching in this? Children are kept busy while I have to bear the burden of internet charges. Children are not studying, they are playing games, and that is a matter of concern. In fact, in another interview in Bhilwara district, the parents said that he did buy a phone, and he's a poor migrant spending about 8,000 rupees because the school was organizing online classes. But he did not give it to the child because he would start playing games, and that he thought was not the best use of the device. So here another mother who was more educated, she had actually gone to college. She also complained. She said, "Madam, please tell me, if others cannot understand online classes, how can children understand?" She then added, task assigned as part of online classes, I get it completed by the child, but the child will benefit only when there is face-to-face teaching. So now, thankfully, because the pandemic has subsided, schools have restarted. So this concern of parents is now taken care of, but parents have complained about the learning loss that students have had to face. So this parent in the district of Bhilwara, he said, whatever he has learned during the whatever he learned prior to the pandemic, he has forgotten, and he has to start all over again. And a teacher in rural Bhilwara said it very clearly. He said, "बच्चों का level तो ना के बराबर हो गया है. which can loosely be translated as children's learning level is close to 0. And and this particular teacher said that for all grades between class 1 to 5, they have had to go back to the beginning and have to start teaching all over again. So for example, for mathematics, it means starting with counting, then addition, and so on. For higher grades, the situation is no better, for example, as indicated in other surveys. But here the focus is on so-called weak students, and more homework, etc., are given to them in order to cope with the learning loss. Now, I can go over the measures that, do I have time, or should I wait for later in the discussion?
You can take a couple of more minutes.
Okay, so some of these problems existed even prior to the pandemic. For example, the national education policy recognized that children did not have foundational literacy and numeracy skills, and it proposed that by 2025, there should be an universal attainment of these skills. The path it proposed was rather centralized. It suggested the setting up of a national mission on foundational literacy and numeracy by the Ministry of Human Resource Development to achieve this goal. Now, several activists and those who are in the education sector have suggested that we move away from this centralized approach to the problem. Rather, it's better to adopt a decentralized approach. In particular, teachers and schools need to be empowered so that they can step away from the course curricula and focus on teaching such that the learning deficiencies of students can be addressed. In Indian context, this can be particularly challenging because classes are often heterogeneous, more often than not heterogeneous, with children of different learning levels. So therefore, it is important that students, teachers and school administrators are given freedom to address this problem at the school level. The second is the provision of digital infrastructure. We know that the pandemic is far from over, and around 10% of children reported not being able to attend online classes because they did not have the appropriate digital infrastructure. This includes that they did not have a laptop, a mobile phone, or other digital device, or the device was being used by someone else at the time when classes were ongoing. Electricity and internet problems were reported by around 3% of children in our sample. So one way to address this problem would be setting up of community digital libraries, which would help bridge this digital divide. The other aspects, of course, relates to the quality of digital knowledge resources. Doordarshan regularly does educational broadcast, but this has been described as a flop show. In fact, a survey that was done across 15 states found that only 1% of rural students and 8% of urban children were regularly accessing these shows. So improving the quality of these educational resources is very important, and in fact, it will be in accordance with the mandate of NEP, which calls for setting up of a digital infrastructure of knowledge sharing, which is termed as Diksha. Now, the third point that I want to make is that the NEP also makes a reference to children attending schools regularly, but it is not clear as to how to achieve this goal. And with children not attending school for long periods of time, school absenteeism may emerge. School absenteeism is a problem in India, and it may emerge. It may get further aggravated because of a long period of school closure. Therefore, it needs to be addressed, and the way to address this would be that the teacher and the school work in accordance with the parent and the community at large, in monitoring the attendance of students, while also making schools an attractive place for students by provision of reading material other than the textbooks and, of course, play materials. And last, and certainly not the least, children who have dropped out of during the pandemic, they need to be brought back into the schooling system, and special efforts need to be made in this regard. Yeah, I would like to close here.
Thank you, Manjistha. That was really required to start thinking about education, because that's going to be one of the biggest losses we will be facing in the years going forward. I want to highlight a little bit about what Manjistha, one part of what she was talking about, which is somehow trying to figure out that there are critical ages at which some of these learning losses could have a lifetime implications for people going forward. The losses that occur at very young ages would leave children vulnerable going forward and increase over time the kind of inequalities that we would expect to see. So as we start prioritizing, where to put a focus, it seems to me that younger ages are particularly important. I suppose I'm a little bit biased on a personal level because I have a 2-year-old grandchild who was born just as COVID began, and she has been speech delayed. And because of that, I have actually been talking to a lot of my friends who have children or grandchildren to see, how they were progressing in speech. And I'm finding that actually many more children than I would have imagined are being speech delayed. And part of it is, I think, that their exposure to people outside their families is very low. And people whom they see are wearing masks, and you're not seeing people's lips moving. Okay, so in some sense, the kind of losses that are occurring in terms of children's learning, it's going to take us a while to recognize and figure out how we are going to deal with it. And yet it is perhaps the biggest necessity for the country as we sort of move forward. Let me now take an opportunity to invite a very special guest who I'm really glad that he could join us. Shri Vijayanand was Secretary, Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Government of India, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Rural Development, and former Chief Secretary to the Government of Kerala. He has done some phenomenal work in the area of developing processes about how to address some of the challenges that we are already talking about. And one of the most interesting programs that he has conceptualized and operationalized is Kudumbashri, the very well-known Kerala social protection program, which has focused on gender, women self-help groups, and identifying vulnerable populations and finding ways of supporting them. So without further ado, let me invite Shri Vijayanand to talk about some of the issues that he has seen going on in the country over the last couple of years and link them to some of the social policies and social protections that we should be thinking about going forward. Thank you, Mr. Vijayanand.
Thank you, Professor Sonaldi. Very happy to have been invited here. All my previous speakers were focusing on hard data, but I'll focus on not just on impressions, but a kind of a macro view which I got. I was active talking to various people during the height of the pandemic. To borrow something from, I'm a student of literature, we saw clearly when we were blinded. But now I'm scared that we are shutting our eyes again as this pandemic is coming to an end. So good that you reminded us all to think deeply about it. And the impact was made worse by failure of institutions, right from constitutional institutions to socio-political institutions like trade unions. We just didn't have any trade unions, at least lamenting about the migrant plights. A little shocking. Then, of course, we all know the absence of laws and systems and programs for social security. They are so scattered that you can't really use them except Narega, the much reviled Narega, it came handy at that point of time. I just can't imagine, but for agriculture and Narega, what would have happened to the country during the pandemic. Then, for the first time, I was in rural development almost throughout my career, and we have been focusing on the agricultural labor, the poor, rural poor. But for the first time, we are now thinking of the non-farm workers who are as poor as the agricultural labor. I think for the first time, I heard in India that word being used commonly, the precariat, who are maybe just above poverty line, who are likely to fall into poverty line. So that is a new target group which has emerged. And surprisingly, they are persons who are supposed to have jobs in micro, small, and sometimes medium industries. Then, of course, the spotlight is on the urban poor, and we don't have that kind of solutions for urban poverty. Whereas for rural, I can give you solid solutions even in the Indian context. Then, new dimensions of vulnerability. People who don't have access to health. We never equated them with vulnerability. That is a new vulnerable, which will be much more serious in future, and also uninsured. Not necessarily a proper formal insurance, but some kind of uninsured. And then somehow I feel that came out in the presentations also, inequality. Has it not worsened the crisis? Though I've not seen any studies which showed that inequality has, at that time, 2020 inequality, not the worsened inequality. The second point I have been asked to make was on what Kudumbashree did. They did everything everywhere. It's too difficult to believe. I don't want to get into the details. It's available in their site. They started with production of sanitizers, masks, and even PPE kits. Then they ran community kitchens for the vulnerable and for the migrants, and doorstep services to the elderly, medicine, rations. It all started in the first month itself, in May itself, April, May. And very remarkably, they were trained to do counseling among themselves. In Kerala, there are about 80 lakh families altogether, roughly, and more than 50% they are in the Kudumbashree network. Barring some tribals and traditional fisher folk, most of the vulnerable are members of Kudumbashree. So that outreach was great. And information sharing. They formed WhatsApp group which had a large participation. And they even went to a remarkable extent of buying laptops on loan for their children. I think they purchased 50,000 laptops for children to do this. So as I said, they did everything everywhere. But what are the policy implications? I think we should be more interested in that. A very important policy implication is Kudumbashree works in partnership with local governments. Not only Gram Panchayats, but also municipalities and corporations. Nowhere in India this is being stressed as a policy. You work together, they are not under the municipality. They are autonomous. So, but they work in partnership, and that has been mutually very helpful to both. I mean, both of them gained. The success of Kerala was panchayats working with the SHGs in the worst of the crisis. And the urban presence of Kudumbashree. That is again a big policy lesson. NULM is extraordinarily weak. About 3 weeks back, we had the Delhi Women's Commission coming to Kerala. We had a long discussion with me on how to bring SHG system in Delhi. It's not easy in a big urban area, but that is necessary. It can be done. That's what Kochi and Trivandrum have proved. Then the networked organization, as Paramita was saying, the collectivization. It's a huge network. So of course, it's organized at the local government level, but it spreads across the state. That feeling of social capital, from self-help to mutual help to social help. So they are very logical, natural steps which we need to understand. I'm sure Paramita will support this thesis of self-help, mutual help to social help, happening almost automatically, not being engineered by any Kudumbashree thing. Then, how micro enterprises can become social enterprises. That's what all this mask making ultimately resulted in. A lot of things they made during this, including community kitchen. So, and can SHGs have a role in the care economy? Not in crisis alone, during normal times also. Care of the elderly, care of the differently abled, and all those kind of things. And of course, I don't have to say the importance of capacity building for SHGs to address these tasks. That is what the state government succeeded. And what are the lessons for social protection? Of course, as we much talked about, but new target groups have emerged. I thought I was an expert in rural development, but I never thought about migrants. I thought they've got a job and gone. Probably is hygiene and sanitation more important, but not livelihoods. But now that has emerged. The informal, semi-formal economy is a new target group for social protection and strong social protection. And a lot of discussion, I participated at least in 5-6 discussion on this employment guarantee for urban areas. And Jean Drèze has come out with a beautiful concept, not very costly, which will really is required now and in future. And of course, a universal social security law with a little bit of basic income being thrown in, not always, I don't think we'll be able to afford, but at least in times. And then something which I learned is that, like we used to discuss in great detail livelihoods as part of NRLM when I was in the Rural Development Department, Government of India, Ministry for 3 years. Now, public health is a livelihoods issue, more than anything else. Earlier we brought in education and all that, but public health is a critical livelihood issue, and NRLM should address that. We can't leave it to the health department. Then something which naturally happened, I was really happy because I was always very unhappy at the level of Panchayat Raj in the poorer parts of India. But when this crisis came, natural allies, civil society organizations, much reviled I know, then the SHGs and Panchayats, they all came together. Really heartening kind of thing. The worst crisis, they saw it through. So this partnership is something which we should see it as social protection. And it is agriculture which saved the day. We all economists say take people away from agriculture and all that. But for agriculture, I don't know what will happen, as I said. But now, can we improve agriculture? I think there are a lot of lessons from the SHG movement or the farmers groups. We all know, thinking of farmers companies. But more than that, the SHG plus the Amul cooperative, a hybrid, can really help the farmers thing. The last point is, you have said capabilities of government for the future. I would rather slightly tweak it to say what should be the priorities. One, portable rights and entitlements, easily done these days. Very important, decentralization of governance. Make them at least function on an as-is where-is basis. Not that you can suddenly transfer resources. The 15th Finance Commission plus MG and RGS is more than enough in rural areas and partly in urban areas. And a guided urbanization in the sense that we know who is coming in, which are the new settlements, where density is increasing. So that kind of things, urban local governments don't have the capacity. And something which you may not agree, I would strongly advocate to reintroduce planning. Not the old Soviet style of planning. The kind of planning which we did, where we used to allocate resources, particularly for the social sector, after a great deal of consultation. We forgot that, so we don't know how much money should go, and that is very, very important, particularly for the social sector, particularly for the vulnerable groups. And a big gap, even in Kerala we are beating about in the bush, is public health in urban areas. We just don't know. We have excellent public health system we have designed, not in, it doesn't work. And then decent jobs in the MSME, but more so in the micro and small. So that is again a priority. Then the Gandhian concept of local economic development has been vindicated in this. The local production, local consumption, local market, and then we move out. Don't forget that. So these are the big lessons of the pandemic. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Vijayanand. It was really interesting the way you wove in the civil society, self-help groups, and broader governmental actions and responsibilities. One of the things that's very interesting about this crisis is that all of a sudden we have woken up to the power of the civil society institutions and self-help groups and individuals and communities to help each other. And yet, I worry a little bit that we may be putting unrealistic expectations from, our civil society institutions, community institutions, or even the grassroots workers like ASHAs and ANMs. Okay? So in some sense, what you did was wonderful because you kind of brought in some of the broader policy initiatives that can be paired with some of the grassroots activities to be able to create a sort of an umbrella of social protection. And what I'd like to do it now is sort of throw open the discussion to the audience as well as to panelists to comment, ask questions. I would particularly like to ask Vidya and Andrew, based on some of the work that they have been doing, which has been very much transnational, cross-national comparative, to see if you think that there are some of the issues you are seeing emerged elsewhere that would make sense from an Indian perspective to think about. So go ahead, please unmute yourself, comment.
Video, you go first.
Yeah, happy to go. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity as well, Small. Yeah, it was really refreshing, first of all, to hear all of these insights, and a lot of it did resonate quite strongly with some of the mixed methods results we've been seeing in other contexts in South Asia and other parts of Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. My comments will be interspersed with questions as well for the panelists. And we'll draw attention to specific themes that were raised throughout the course of these discussions. So one theme that's, for example, Professor Tanuka and other colleagues had highlighted was around food insecurity being particularly high and increasing and becoming more aggravated. From our other research in various contexts, Cambodia, Afghanistan, elsewhere, amongst households in poverty in particular, even pre-pandemic, food insecurity rates were quite high and it's only worsening. So in this context, with COVID adding to the burdens, we've seen that for some of these households, relying on reducing consumption alone as a coping strategy, as a consequence of the crisis, is often inadequate. So as a result, you see heightened food insecurity, but you also concurrently see other erosive coping strategies, which in many cases then are pushing households towards destitution. So poor households becoming poorer, vulnerable, precarious households falling into poverty as well. So I was curious if any of these types of issues resonated in the context of your research on India, how these coping strategies might have combined with the consequences of food insecurity, and in particular, what might have been the distributional differences that we see. A second point I'll highlight is around education that Manjista very eloquently conveyed. And we also heard from Paramita as well the issue of gender and gender vulnerabilities that were exacerbated in this context. I'd like to understand if there's any overlaps in these two sets of issues in terms of inequalities from gender and inequalities due to wealth and poverty as well that have been particularly compounded at the intersections. And of course, this might have differences for certain groups. So any differentiation by other groups, such as by Adivasis or so on, would also be very welcome. And I think this is particularly relevant because in the context of India, of course, learning poverty, that's the share of children being unable to read or understand a simple text by age 10. I believe a couple of years ago, it stood at around 55%. So this is a low threshold itself, but if you're thinking of poverty escapes, our research from CPAN has found that access or completion of at least lower secondary education is quite important in household trajectories out of poverty and sustaining poverty escapes. So in a context where learning poverty is already quite high, that doesn't bode well then for this, for access or completion of secondary levels to sustain escapes. I'll end my first set of interventions there and continue later on if time allows.
You know, it would be great to have any of the panelists respond to these comments before we move on to Andrew. I think these are very interesting questions and comments. Tanuka, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I actually, yes, food insecurity for the entire effect to play out, one has to assess again. This was a survey. There were 4 rounds of survey over, till June, July to December, a shorter period. After that, we all know there was a second wave. There would have been further impact. But yes, there was a role of the ration system, the PDS here, that really did provide a kind of a, buttress to kind of those poor families. And secondly, there was this Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana. You must be knowing that they did give out this wheat and pulses, to, I think, huge number of people for a long time. So that kind of the food shock was a little bit absorbed by those things. It was, in fact, it was extended later also. So I think that kind of helped a bit. But obviously, the protein thing, the as somebody else also said, I think Paramita maybe, the dairy, this thing, eggs and so on, that would definitely have impact on nutrition and health of the children. But that again, to really quantitatively measure, or, that one needs a different kind of survey to really estimate that impact, right? Because it will take a little bit of time to play it out. That's my view. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Paramita, do you want to jump in, and then Manjista?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I agree with Tanakaben on this, but yeah, so Vidya, you wrote some of these things around like the additional vulnerabilities, right? And I think that's one of the things that's so important for us to look at. So I think after Mr. Vijayanand had said the thing about inequality in India, and some of the data that's coming out of it is actually really fascinating, because it seems like maybe inequality is decreasing if you remove the top 1% and all, and that's really maybe not what some of us would have guessed. But I think just looking at all of this with an intersectional lens shows us, so one of the things that we've done, like we've seen with tribal populations, right? So food access, food insecurity during lockdowns, that's a whole, that's like an issue that maybe is like even global, right? Like what happens during a lockdown. But moving on beyond that, right? So the women tribal, like women Adivasis, and the issues that they are facing are very different from the issues that an urban woman, like an urban poor woman, is facing, right? So we're talking about complete isolation there. We're talking about the impact that isolation has on the nature of a trade itself. If we're talking about, say, Tendu Patta leaf pickers, right? So they're the ones who do work in like non-tribal forestry, like NTFP work. What the consequences of like the trade itself and then not being allowed to gather together and do this work, right? You're talking about the entire, in some ways, the deconstruction of a trade, which is something that has been their entire main source, right? And I think that's really important to understand that some trades have gone away, and these are women-only trades, and then some other new trades have popped up. But what does this mean? And this is where I think Manjishta's like comment on like education, right? And like it's a skilling gap that we're going to be seeing across these generations, and all of these impacts are just going to keep playing out. And trying to get an idea of this, like this is not something that now, even if we ever go back to a post-COVID normal, these effects are just going to keep popping up every year. I think we're going to see the impacts of this pandemic in ways that we haven't for like the next, I'm guessing the next 2 decades at least, like the longer term consequences of education, lack of nutrition, the impact on mobility, the impact on trades, the failure of institutions. I think these are all just really long-term conversations that we're going to be seeing for a very long time.
Thank you. Manjista, do you want to?
Yeah, so my question was regarding the gender effects and the socioeconomic differences. Now, I think there are several layers to my response. So if I take into account the likelihood of dropout and the likelihood of access to remote education, in the national capital region, as I said, the difference is not significant. But then these are in a way, very crude measures, and the results are very and are limited to the national capital region alone. A recent study that has been published, a policy brief rather, that has been published by Population Council, shows that in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh there is a gendered effect of school closure, in the sense that Girls were doing more household chores during the period of lockdown, so they had less time to spend on their education, as well as the digital divide was greater among. They had lower access to remote education than the boys. The other aspect of it is that I think in Delhi NCER, because the fertility levels are not high, and what the school was doing was that it was providing remote education to higher classes as opposed to the lower classes. So if the older child was a girl and the school was providing online education, the girl did get access to that education, but this result, again I'm stressing, cannot be extended to the country as a whole. Now, when it comes to social stratification, whether along caste lines or along economic class, there is indeed a difference, and that difference remains significant in a multivariate framework. So about if I recall correctly, in the top quintile, nearly 75% or close to 80% had some form of access to remote education. This drops down to 30% for the poorest quintile. And likewise, the general caste had much higher access than the Muslim Dalit population. So there is a huge difference. Yeah, and again, I'm stressing this is the Delhi NCR region, and across the country, this gap is going to be wider still.
Thank you, Manjista. And I know Andrew had some comments.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Danika.
No, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that we were also doing some study in the Delhi region, and gender effect not clear, but this number of mobiles in the household, that is an issue, number of children, because you might have one device and 3 children, so that is one problem. And in the UNICEF IHD study, we found, it's not just the girls, but the paid work, a lot of children were actually they were seeking either already in paid work or they were seeking paid work. So that was another angle, in terms of child protection, which had come up in our study. Not strictly, so education, like it was just going out for a toss anyhow. So that is it.
Thank you. Andrew?
Well, thank you very much. I'll make 3 points fairly briefly, hopefully. One is really a question for everybody, I suppose. The speakers have outlined some of the reasons why there might be significant impoverishment as a result of the pandemic. So the reduced remittances, the reduced wages, the increased share of work, which is casual, and also livestock becoming a burden. And livestock, of course, we know, has been a source of savings and a source of upward mobility. So for many people, very, very important. So as well as there being a lot of downward mobility and maybe even some destitution, although maybe the good functioning of the PDS and the MNREGA scheme has prevented that, I don't know. Escapes from poverty look like they may have also become more difficult, of course, during the pandemic and probably for some time after the pandemic. So I would imagine that the trend of poverty will be upwards. The number of poor people in India will have increased, the proportion of the population will have increased, and so on. No doubt varied across the different states. But I suppose my question comes really from what Mr. Vijayanand was talking about. He was beginning to outline a kind of comprehensive program of recovery or of preventing impoverishment in a way, but the two things may be quite similar. But I was just wondering if the government or anybody in India is coming up with this sort of comprehensive idea, which would need to have much more of an urban focus than traditional Indian poverty reduction solutions. So that was a question for all of you, really. And a couple of other issues. One is, I think it was Professor Tanuka was saying that savings got exhausted early on in the pandemic, in the first wave of the pandemic. And this is something that we've found across the different countries where we've carried out this poverty monitoring initiative work. Savings got exhausted, but also social capital got exhausted. So people's networks became exhausted. And I was wondering if there was evidence of that in India. I imagine that there would be. They became very stretched, and poor people could no longer rely on the networks that previously they had been able to rely on. And of course, again, thinking about escaping poverty, a lot of that happens because of networks. You know, you migrate with the help of a network, you accumulate capital with the help of a network, you educate your children with the help of a network, and so on. So I think networks can be very important and have been degraded. And then thirdly and finally, on education, I think what you've reported in India has also been the case in many other countries, and countries, you know, much wealthier than India as well. I think an interesting thing that came out of Manjista's presentation was the way that there was a parallel in terms of neglect between the neglect of the institutions and the neglect of the households, that the households were not prioritizing perhaps education. Now that is something that varies quite a lot across country. And maybe part of India's neglect of education, relative neglect of education in terms of public expenditure and so on, is also perhaps because you haven't got that high level of demand from at least the bottom half of the distribution in India for education. And I mean, I wonder whether that's a long-term issue, but you know, needs some attention. But in a emergency situation, I think one of the reasons that education was neglected was perhaps because no solutions were immediately available. It was a sudden shock to the system. And it took, and this was true in Britain and everywhere, you know, it took the institutions quite a bit of time, probably the best part of 9 months, I would say, to work out what to do and how to do it. And the first attempts were pretty bad. I mean, here in the UK, you know, the first attempts at online education were not good at all. The second attempt in the second wave and third wave was much better. And I imagine a similar thing happened in India. But I would also like to say that in humanitarian agencies work generally, education is also neglected. You know, in emergency, you think of the regular floods which close schools for a period of time. Nobody really thinks about education. They just close, kids stay at home, and then when the flood has gone and the flood relief programs have taken place, the kids go back to school. And I think, I mean, there are exceptions to that, and humanitarian agencies have got better at thinking about education, but it does seem to be a very commonly neglected aspect of emergencies in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Your comment reminded me of a study I had seen on Pakistan, where I think it was during the earthquake when schools were closed for 3 months. The children lost not just 3 months, but they actually lost 1.5 years worth of learning because of just being away from school. So yes, I think you're right that it's an issue that now will be on forefront for pretty much all the emergencies now that we have seen such major impacts. But let me turn to Mr. Vijayanand to respond to some of your comments, and then perhaps Santanu would like to come in with some comments.
Yeah, the first question where I'm not part of government now, but I don't see any initiatives in the urban areas, which is probably very important. Of course, they have brought the registration system for migrants, but still in its very early stage. And the social security law is very weak. The new code also doesn't help. It's more a statement of intention. That's my understanding. Probably I've not studied it in great depth, but I know some of it. And the second point is regarding social capital, particularly in rural areas. It was stressed, but I think it survived and probably improved. People knowing each other, helping each other. resource starved, but the social capital became stronger. That's the impression I get even from outside Kerala. I'm talking to people particularly in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and places of that kind.
Santanu, would you like to come in?
Thanks, Sonal. I don't have much to add here. It's a great discussion. Yeah, just on the context of food security, I mean, what we have seen in our study, and as Manjista mentioned many times, that it's in the Delhi NCAER context, but still, I think the PDS system worked reasonably well. I mean, there are urban exclusions we have seen even in the context of access to ration, etc. But in general, I think the basic food security has not. I mean, basic food security was there. People had received ration. I mean, additional ration in addition to what they used to receive, and additional free ration. So that helped them sustain during this period. But as all of you mentioned that there were no diet diversity as such. It was just yeah, I mean roti and achar and so on. So yeah, that just wanted to add. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know Paramita made a comment in the chat box. I will just actually turn to her to articulate it.
Yeah, sorry, just to expand a little bit on what Mr. Vijayanandan said, that even when the government is trying to come up with solutions, they're kind of missing the boat on this, right? So when they for instance, they realized that businesses and enterprises need support, and they came up with, they've given more financing to the Ministry of Small, Micro, Medium Enterprises. However, none of it is earmarked for those enterprises that, for instance, have an annual turnover of 10 lakhs, which is really at the bottom, right? It's all for enterprises that are at the higher end, right? So even when you're coming up with a solution, and when you're trying, you're not actually getting the full picture of the problem and where that solution support might really have magnifying multiplicative effects. And I think that's also part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point, considering the fact that in India, we have actually taken pride in some of the entrepreneurship in the pre-COVID times as a way of sort of getting out of poverty, increasing growth, and so on. We are coming up on the hour, but I would like to open it up for the audiences. If anyone listening has any comments, questions.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand also if you don't want to write in the chat box.
You know, it's been such a rich discussion. I think it's at some point we are all beginning to take a breather. That yes, hopefully we won't be going into another wave of pandemic. That the third wave has been a little bit milder than the second one. But as we sort of begin to emerge, we are going to find a lot of long-term impacts, particularly health impacts and so on. So I appreciate this discussion, and I hope, you know, as a society, we can keep this discussion growing so that even out of this, the darkest hours that we have all lived through, there would be some silver lining as we begin to rethink, you know, how to support each other and how to support the society. Okay. But thank you very much. My heartfelt thanks to all the panelists today, to Vidya, Andrew, and others. Thank you, and I hope we can keep this conversation going. Goodbye.